It is suggested that the Ludim were the dominant race, or Egyptians proper, who were called in Egyptian Lut or Rut, i.e. men par excellence, that the Anamim were the Anu of the monuments, who were dispersed widely over the Nile Valley, and gave names to On, Heliopolis, and other cities, that the Naphtuhim, Ta, were the domain of Ta, or people of Memphis. Pathruism, Tores, the people of the south, were inhabitants of the Thebaid. Okay, so were these the original Anunnaki? Maybe, maybe not. Etc. But these identifications are all of them more or less uncertain, and it would seem that whatever tribal differences may have existed at the first time, they had disappeared, all but disappeared, by the time that the history of Egypt becomes known to us. The only real distinction that remained was one between the people of the south country and those of the north, who had their respective peculiarities and even spoke dialects that were somewhat different. Otherwise, the various Egyptian tribes had been fused together and moulded into one compact and homogeneous people before the time when history first takes cognizance of them. Historical records reveals them, right? Intellectually, the Egyptians, or take notice of them, intellectually the Egyptians must take rank among the foremost nations of remote antiquity, but cannot compare with the great European races, whose rise was later the Greeks and Romans. Don't think Rawlinson was being racist there. It has that hint, but superior European race and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Their minds possessed much subtlety and acuteness. They were very fond of composition, poetry, writing, literature, all this sort of stuff, and made considerable advances in many of the sciences. They were intelligent, ingenious, speculative. It is astonishing what an extensive literature they possessed at a very early date, where others didn't have it probably. They weren't as advanced. Books on religion, on morals, law, rhetoric, arithmetic, mensuration, geometry, medicine, books of travels, and above all, novels. But the merit of the works is slight. The novels are vapid, the medical treatises interlarded with charms and exorcisms, the mysticism, all that sort of stuff. The travels devoid of interest, the general style of all the books forced and stilted. Egypt may in some particulars have stimulated Greek thought, directing it into new lines and giving it a basis to work upon. The Greeks probably plagiarised them and claimed their works or their religion, their writings, etc. as their own, as they did when they went back to Athens, and the Athenians didn't like that and often chased them out of town or beheaded them and stuff like that, because they didn't want a replacement philosophy, right? Egypt may in some particulars have stimulated Greek thought, directing it into new lines and giving it a basis to work upon, but otherwise it cannot be said that the world owes much of its intellectual progress to this people, about whose literary productions there is always something that is weak and childish. In art, the power which the Egyptians exhibited was doubtless greater. The architecture was on the grandest scale and dwarfs the Greek in comparison. But even here it is to be noted that the higher qualities of art were wanting. The architecture produces its effect by mere mass. There is no beauty of proportion. On the contrary, the gigantic columns are clumsy from the undue massiveness and are far too thickly crowded together. They are rather rounded piers than pillars, and the capitals are coarse and heavy. Don't forget, Rawlinson went to Egypt and he wrote all this down. He examined it and wrote it all down. The coloured ornamentation used was over-glaring. The forms of the ornamentation was almost always stiff and sometimes absolutely hideous. Well, he's not praising them in this situation. He's actually undermining them. In mimetic art, the Egyptians might perhaps have done better had they been at liberty to allow their natural powers free scope. But they worked in shackles. A dull, dead conventionalism bore sway over the land, and through some exceptions occur, Egyptian mimetic art is in the main a reproduction of these same unvarying forms without freedom of design or vigour of treatment. In morals, the Egyptians combined an extraordinary degree of theoretic perfection with an exceedingly lax and imperfect practice. It has been said that the 42 laws of the Egyptian religion, the laws of Ma'at, contained in the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead falls short in nothing of the teachings of Christianity, and conjectured that Moses, in compiling his code of laws, did but translate into Hebrew the religious precepts which he found in the sacred books of the people among whom he had been brought up, i.e. the Egyptians. Yeah, don't forget also that this George Rawlinson was an ordained minister. We're pretty sure that's what it said. Go back and check that out. He was appointed Canon of Canterbury. He was ordained in 1841, was curate at Merton. It could mean something. Maybe it might have been a religious ordained minister. He was ordained in 1841, was curate at Merton, Oxfordshire from 1846 to 1847. It could mean in this sense that he was deemed, he became certified as a curate at Merton. That could be what it's really pointing at. It may not be saying he was a Christian minister, but then again, he may have been. You need to find more information on him and that. Any more statements of him being ordained as a minister, a Christian minister. Okay, so in morals, the Egyptian combined an extraordinary degree of theoretic perfection with an exceedingly lax and imperfect practice, and so forth. Okay, Moses' laws, he basically plagiarized the laws of Ma'at, the 42 laws of Ma'at from Egypt. Such expressions are no doubt exaggerated, but they convey what must be allowed to be a fact, that there is a very close agreement between the moral law of the Egyptians and the precepts of the Decalogue, the ones of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc. But with this profound knowledge of what was right, so much beyond that of most heathen nations, the practice of the people was rather below than above the common level. The Egyptian women were notoriously of loose character, and whether as we meet with them in history or as they are depicted in the Egyptian romance, appear as immodest and licentious. Okay, he's not really favouring him, is he, in his rant? The men practised impurity openly and boasted of it in their writings. They were industrious, cheerful, nay, even gay, merry, right, under hardships. Not saying that they're homosexuals, and not wanting in family affection, but they were cruel, vindictive, treacherous, avaricious, prone to superstition, and profoundly servile. Okay, the use of the stick was universal. Not only was the bastinado the ordinary legal punishment for minor offences, but superiors of all kinds freely beat the inferiors. The poor peasantry were compelled by blows to satisfy the rapacity of the tax gatherers, and slaves everywhere performed their work under fear of the rod, which was applied to the backs of laggards by the taskmaster. So the biblical account of the Jews being slaves, or whoever was there being oppressed, were actually being beaten by these people. They were hard taskmasters. The passions of the Egyptians were excessive and often led on to insurrection, riot, and even murder. They were fanatical in the extreme, ever ready to suspect strangers of insulting their religion, and bent on washing out such insults by bloodshed. So all this Pan-Africanism, etc., that they were nice and they invited people in when there was a famine, all that sort of stuff, could be a load of baloney. Or maybe they were compassionate, kind in various portions, but very hard taskmasters. When conquered, no people were more difficult to govern, and even under their native kings they needed a strong hand to keep them in subjection. But though thus impetuous and difficult to restrain when their passions were roused, they were at other times timid, cringing, submissive, prone to fawn and flattery. The lower classes prostrated themselves before their superiors. Blows were quietly accepted and tamely submitted to. The great nobles exhibited equal civility towards the monarch, whom they addressed as if he were a god, and to whose kind favour they attributed it that they were allowed to continue to live. Yeah, he beat the hell out of them, but he didn't kill them. Right? He just beat the living crap out of them to an extent, to a point, right? So there'd be subservience, right? They'll be in servitude to him. Is it supposed to be all together? The Egyptians were wanting in manliness and spirit. They at no time made good soldiers, and though they had some considerable successes in the early wars when they attacked undisciplined hordes with large bodies of well-disciplined troops, yet whenever they encountered an enemy acquainted with the art of war, they suffered defeat. As allies, they were not to be depended on. Always ready to contract engagements, they had no hesitation in breaking them where their fulfilment would have been dangerous or inconvenient, and hence their neighbours spoke of Egypt as a bruised reed, whereon if a man lean, it would go into his hand and pierce it. Another defect in the Egyptian character was softness and inclination to luxurious living. Drunkenness was a common vice among the young, because they used to make beer, didn't they? And among the upper class, generally, sensual pleasure and amusement were made ordinarily the ends of existence. False hair was worn, dyes and cosmetics used to produce an artificial beauty. Great banquets were frequent. Games and sports of 1,000 different kinds were in vogue. Dress was magnificent. Equipages were splendid. Life was passed in feasting, sport, and a constant succession of enjoyments. It is true that some seem not to have been spoiled by their self-indulgence, or at any rate to have retained in old age a theoretic knowledge of what was right, but the general effect of such a life cannot but have been hurtful to the character, and the result is seen in the gradual decline of the Egyptian power and the successive subjections of the country by hardier and stronger races, i.e. the Ethiopians, Assyrians, Persians and Macedonian Greeks, those of Alexander the Great and Ptolemy, etc. There is considerable difficulty in determining the amount of the population of ancient Egypt at that particular time. Josephus gave the number at 7,800,000 in his day, when the population was probably less numerous than under the native kings. Diodorus prefers the round number of 7 million and says that in his time the population was not less than it had been under the pharaohs or the kings. An English scholar of repute regards 6 million as the maximum of the census of ancient Egypt, while another is convinced that the real amount was not above 5 million. If the class of professional soldiers really numbered above 400,000 men, as Herodotus, supposed father of history, declares, he's usually proven wrong now, or exaggerates, that class being only 1 out of 7, distinct altogether from the priests, the herdsmen, the shopkeepers, the boatmen, the swineherds, and the interpreters, it is difficult to resist a conviction. Okay, so they actually had swine. We're being told that historically they didn't like pigs, didn't like the idea that these Hebrews or Jews had pigs running around in their house while they were sleeping, and all this sort of stuff. Okay, the interpreters, it is difficult to resist a conviction that the native Egyptian alone must have amounted at least to 5 million. 5 million. To this a considerable addition, an addition of probably not less than 1/3, must be made for slaves and casual visitors, which would raise the sum total of the population nearly to the estimate of Diodorus. At such an estimate, even if confined to the Nile Valley, the Delta and the Fayum alone would not imply a density of more than about 600 to the square mile, a rate less than that of East Flanders and of many English countries which are not particularly thickly peopled or heavily populated. It may well be accepted as probably not in excess of the truth. We have now to pass from the consideration of the Egyptians themselves to that of the peoples or nations who inhabited the neighbouring countries. The nations which bounded Egypt on the east, the west and the south belonged to 3 distinct races, and bore in the Egyptian language 3 distinct appellations. To the west were the Rebu or Lebu, who may safely be identified with the Libyans of the Greek historians and geographers. the inhabitants of the entire north coast from Egypt to the Atlantic Ocean, after whom the Greeks called the whole continent Libya. The monument represents this people as a white race with blue eyes and fair hair. Yeah, we read about that before. That in Africa there were actually these white Libyans. They were a white race with blue hair and fair hair. Blue eyes and fair hair. It has been conjectured that they came originally from northern Europe and crossed into Africa by way of Spain and Italy. Probably they found in the countries which they overran a darker people with whom they intermingled and into which they were ultimately absorbed. But in the earlier Egyptian period this change had not taken place, and Egyptians represented them as described above, emphasizing, it may be, and exaggerating the tints which were to them strange and unaccustomed. The Rebu or Libyans, called sometimes Tahinnu, were numerous and warlike, but under ordinary circumstances they were greatly divided, and the occasions were few and far between, in which union was so far established that they became formidable to any of their neighbours. Once only in Egyptian history was the kingdom of the pharaohs, or the kingdom of the kings, seriously threatened from this quarter, when in the reign of Meneptah, the son of Ramesses II, about BC 1250, a great invasion of western Egypt took place under the conduct of the chief of the Rebu, and a doubtful contest was waged for some time between this prince and the Egyptian monarch. Towards the south, Egypt had for her immediate neighbours the Nasi or Nahasu, who were blacks and it is thought true Negroes without turned lips and woolly hair, and who were found in the Nile Valley between the first cataract and in this country on either side of it, or in all the more northern portion of the tract, which is now known as Nubia. So they might have been Nubians, originally Nubians. They were true Negroes. It's not saying that they were the true Egyptians by the looks of it. The tribes of the Nasi were numerous. The temple was turbulent and impatient of subjection. They rejected civilization, wore scarcely any clothes, and made frequent inroads on the more southern of the Egyptian provinces with a view to plunder and rapine. To loot and plunder and do unspeakable things, probably. The Egyptian kings were forced to lead expeditions against them continually in order to keep them in check and punish their depredations, but no serious danger could ever menace the monarchy from enemies who, though numerous, were ill-armed, scattered, and quite incapable of coalescing or getting it together, right, with them. Yeah, speaking on equal terms and, living side by side sort of thing, getting along. Beyond the Nasi, however, further to the south and inclining to the east of south, was a formidable power, a nation known to the Egyptians as the Kish or Kush, and to the Greeks and Romans as the Ethiopians, who occupied the broad tract lying between the Nile and Bahr el Azraq on the one hand and the Atbara on the other, extending perhaps also across the Atbara and at times holding the Nile Valley along its entire course from Khartoum to the borders of Egypt. So these Kush with a K were, as we found with the scriptural records, genealogy, etc., history, that Abraham's descendants may have walked into Africa. They were the Cushites, Cushitees, and then they intermingled with these people residing in a certain geographical location, perhaps Ethiopia, and intermarried with them, merged with them, intermingled, married them, and produced these descendants who were half-breeds, and they became the new Cushites, or tribe with a capital K. Okay, so there's a difference. The ones from the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Syria, and then the ones that were Chaldea, etc., that went into Egypt, went into Africa, intermingled, intermarried, and had these half-breed descendants. Kush, or the Ethiopians. This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as Caucasian. This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as Caucasian. This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as Caucasian. This people was not of Negro blood, but it is. This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as Caucasian. This people was not of Negro blood, but is to be regarded as Caucasian. It was ethnically connected with the Canaanites, the southern Arabians, the primitive Babylonians or Akkadians, and with the Egyptians themselves. Its best modern representatives are probably the Gallus, Agal, Wallitza, etc. of modern Abyssinia. This people formed at any rate in the later Egyptian times a single settled monarchy with a capital at Napata, Gebel Berkel, or at Meroe, Dankala. They were to a considerable extent civilized, though their civilization does not appear to have been self-originated, but was due to Egyptian influence. They were numerous, warlike, of great strength, and more than common height. They possessed a fair amount of discipline, and were by far the most important of the enemies against whom the Egyptians had to contend in Africa. On the eastern border, where it was not washed by the Red Sea, the Egyptians came into contact with tribes which they called by the generic name of Amu, people, or perhaps herdsmen. They had cattle, stock, right? Okay, probably had sheep, goats, etc., whom they seemed to have regarded with a special contempt. They disliked them, they couldn't stand them. Contempt and dislike. They had from a remote period been subject to aggression in this quarter, and a portion of the Amu had actually effected a lodgment within the territory naturally belonging to Egypt, and held all the northeastern portion of the delta about the lake Menzaleh and the cities known as Zoan, Zan, Tanis, and Ramesses. These Amu were, of course, Egyptian subjects, but there were likewise Amu beyond the Egyptian borders, in Syria and Palestine. Mostly the Amorites, who were almost perpetually at war with Egypt in the earliest times. Of these Amu, the most important tribes were those of the Kita or Keta, children of Heth, Hittites, the Karu, or the Haru, Cherethites, and the Rutenu, who seemed to represent the Syrians. Another enemy of the Egyptians in this quarter was a people called Shasu, perhaps identical with the Hyksos and seemingly Arabs. Ordinarily, the Shasu were not regarded as a formidable foe, but once in the course of Egyptian history, owing to circumstances that are unexplained, they made a great invasion, conquered all the lower country, and for many years held it in subjection. Yeah, they went to Ramesses, the province of Ramesses, or land of Ramesses, and destroyed those holy temples, etc. They were there for quite a while. We read that they might have been the Assyrians, an Assyrian horde. Who knows? Otherwise, one would have said that Egypt had little to fear from her immediate neighbours upon the east, who were at once numerically weak, and powerless through their multitudinous divisions.